Your trial may become your testimony if you'll just quit fighting God about it. Quit getting mad at God for the problems that you're encountering. This morning we are in Acts chapter 26, verse 1 through 32, the entirety of the chapter here, and we're rapidly approaching the end of the book of Acts. Right here, Paul is on trial, somewhat of a trial. He's at a hearing. He's giving a defense of himself before King Herod Agrippa II. He is in Caesarea. He is about to be shipped off. That's what we'll read about in chapter 27 is Paul's journey to Rome, which was perilous to say the least. Shipwreck, loss of life, great difficulty on that journey. But this is the last leg before they journey out on the boat and head over to Rome. And Paul again is giving a defense of himself before the Jewish king, the king of Judea, King Herod Agrippa II. There in the presence of the hearing is also the Roman tribunal, the Roman court, and then also Porcius Festus, who is the governor of the region just as well. And he would have been subordinate to King Herod Agrippa. And so you'll see Agrippa takes the center stage of the address here from much of this part, but then Festus, he'll chime in towards the end, and he'll say something that we would think is a little bit comical. But I want to tell you this morning about when your trials can become a testimony. When your trials can become a testimony. And this is the truth, that when you live your life for God's glory and make His mission your passion, your trial can become a testimony to Jesus. Now, those things have to be there in the equation in order for it to be functional. When you live for God's glory and you make His mission your passion, your trial can become a testimony to Jesus. There's one such man that I think of when I think about a trial, a difficulty becoming a testimony to Jesus. This man really just came to the forefront of my mind when I was thinking about this. I don't know if many of you may have heard of this man, I'm not sure, but there's an evangelist by the name of David Ring. Has anybody ever heard of that man? There's an evangelist by the name of David Ring. There's something very unique about this man. This man is a powerful evangelist, a worldwide traveler. He's preached to many tens and hundreds of thousands of people. He has won countless people to faith in Jesus. Something very unique about this man, though. This man is debilitated by cerebral palsy. Debilitated by cerebral palsy. Can barely get through his sermon. You have to take probably about 5 minutes to get acclimated to the cadence of his voice, because it stammers and it stutters along, because his body doesn't function the way that most humans' bodies function. But you know what? In the sermons that I've seen of him, one notable sermon that I've seen of him, he talks about his life for Jesus. And he talks about all the things that he's been through and how none of these things have kept him from Jesus. All the things that he's suffered with, that none of these things have kept him from Jesus. In fact, they've been used by God for a powerful testimony in his life, a powerful testimony to the grace of God. And he says this, he points his finger, it's crooked, it's shriveled, and he points his finger at the people and he says, I have cerebral palsy. What's your excuse? What's your excuse? Friends, anybody's trial can become their testimony. Anybody's. I think of a blind man who lived in the middle of an old city and a new city. A blind man who lived in between the two Jerichos. And he sits there on the side of the road and he's crying out because he feels the rumble on the ground. He hears the clamor coming down the road, and somebody shouts and says, "There's Jesus of Nazareth. There's the Son of David, and he's coming." And blind Bartimaeus cries out to the Lord that the Lord would see him and the Lord would find him. Bartimaeus can't see Jesus but through the eyes of faith, but he knows that Jesus can see him. He's hoping that Jesus will hear him, and Jesus comes to that man and he heals him. He makes his eyes to see. And all the while, people have been asking the question, is Bartimaeus blind because of his own sin, or is he blind because of his parents' sin? He's got to be blind because of somebody's sin. And you remember what Jesus says to these thoughts of other people? He says, "This man was born blind for the glory of God." That the glory of God might be revealed through Jesus. Bartimaeus was born blind so that he could be used to serve as a proof of the divinity of Jesus. So that he could serve as a proof of the saving work of Jesus. So that he could serve as proof that Jesus is Lord of heaven and earth. Friend, that is the purpose of whatever trials you go through. Is to make much of Jesus. Your trial can become a testimony. But there's some things that have to change. There's some things that have to change if your trial is going to ever become a testimony to Jesus. And we'll look at those truths. We'll look at those changes that have to be made here. Look at verse 1 through 23, and you'll see Paul's trial testimony. Paul's trial testimony. Now, this is a testimony in two different ways. It's a testimony in the sense that Paul is making an apology. He's giving an apologetic, a defense for himself against the accusations. Now, that's Paul's trial testimony. But there's a whole nother trial testimony that goes on here in the forefront. It's not Paul defending himself against accusations. Paul uses his trial in order to announce Jesus. In order to tell Agrippa, Porcius Festus, the Roman tribunal, and all those who were witnessing, to tell them about Jesus. He does it all throughout this chapter. And so verse 1 through 23 is Paul's trial testimony. Look with me here, beginning in verse 1. It says, "So Agrippa," that's King Agrippa, "said to Paul, 'You have permission to speak for yourself.' Then Paul stretched out his hand and made his defense." Can you see that picture there in your mind? Paul in Caesarea, in a palace, in a king's courtroom. Paul making a defense before himself, though he would not have stood there the way I stand here. Paul would have been worn down. He probably would have had ratted out clothes. And the Bible tells me just as well that Paul is in chains. In fact, he tells Agrippa there in verse 29, he says, I wish that you and everyone around me would become such as I am. A follower of Jesus would become such as I am, except for these chains." And so as Paul raises his hand to give this address before King Agrippa, can you imagine? Can you hear the chains clanging around on his arm? Here's Paul with his hands raised up, with these heavy chains weighing him down as though he were a criminal, as though he had done something wrong, though he is entirely innocent. But this is what Paul says here in verse 2. "I consider myself fortunate." Is that your first thought when you get into a trial? I consider myself fortunate that it is before you, King Agrippa, I am going to make my defense today against all the accusations of the Jews, especially because you are familiar with all the customs and controversies of the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. Paul says, I consider it fortunate to give a defense before you, Agrippa. Now, in some ways, I believe Paul obviously is referring here to the fact that Agrippa is a Jew. Agrippa was reared in Judaism. He would have understood the customs and the controversies, as Paul says, of the Jews. He would have been much different than Antonius Felix, the previous governor, and now Porcius Festus, the current governor of the province. This man, King Agrippa, would have been much more familiar with the things that Paul is being accused of. So in that way, Paul says, I consider myself fortunate to give a defense before you, to answer these accusations before you, King Agrippa, because you'll understand. You'll know what we're talking about. Because to Porcius Festus over here, he has no clue what the Jews are clamoring about. He has no idea what they're accusing me of. He has no realm of understanding into the things of the Jews. All he sees is that there are people who are rioting and want me dead. And here am I, a lonesome man, not surrounded by anybody, giving a defense. So I consider myself fortunate to give a defense before you, King Agrippa. But I believe that Paul considered himself fortunate to give a defense before King Agrippa, not just because Agrippa was familiar with Judaism, but because King Agrippa needed to hear about Jesus. King Agrippa was going to hear about Jesus, and Agrippa is the one that has given Paul the opportunity. So Paul says, I consider myself fortunate. In fact, he says this, look at verse 3. He says, therefore I beg you to listen to me patiently. I beg you. Now, why would Paul say, I beg you, Agrippa, listen to me patiently. Hear me out. Paul wants the trial to go forward, but this is the peculiar thing. You remember that at the end of chapter 25, Paul has appealed to Caesar. And he has already been given the ruling. To Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you will appear. So tell me, what kind of authority would King Agrippa have had here if Paul has already appealed to Caesar? And in those days, Agrippa would not have taken away the honor and the privilege that Caesar Nero was given at that point. You're going to be heard by Nero. That's what Paul's been told. So King Agrippa at this point is a subordinate. King Agrippa at this point is going to have to yield for Nero's ruling. He's going to have to wait. So is Agrippa here in order to hand down a ruling on Paul to either save or spare his life or kill him? No. He's not here to hand down that kind of ruling. You remember what Festus had said? He said, we're going to send him off to Caesar. That's who he's appealed to. But Agrippa, I don't know really what to write. I don't know what this is all about. But Agrippa, you know the things of the Jews, and you could understand much better what this is all about. So you're going to sit here, Agrippa, would you please listen to Paul and get an understanding so we can write a letter to Nero. We can tell him what everything's about. He says it's hardly understandable to send a prisoner to Caesar himself with no kind of description about what he's being accused of. I need your help, Agrippa. So Agrippa is not here to free or to imprison Paul. Agrippa is here just to hear the account. Agrippa is here just to lend an ear. And Paul is more than glad to talk to him. Paul is more than glad to give his testimony about everything. Now, why is this? Why is Paul so permissible, so permitting, so okay with everybody peering into his life constantly? He's being examined by Antonius Felix, by Porcius Festus, by the Sanhedrin, now by King Agrippa, now by the tribunal. He's going to be examined by Caesar. Why is Paul okay with everybody meddling in his business? Everybody is looking into him. I believe I know the exact reason why Paul is okay with that. See, for Paul, there was no area of his life that was not ruled by Jesus. There's no area of his life that is not about Jesus. Paul's an open book. Paul is there to be peered into, there to be examined by anybody and by all. And so he's able to allow his trial, to allow his difficulty to be an examination of him, because he knows when people look at him, they're going to see Jesus. Paul is ready to make a defense for the hope that is within him. So if your trial is ever going to become a testimony of Jesus, this is what has to happen. You have to live your life solely for Jesus. You have to live your life solely for Jesus, wholly for Jesus, completely for Jesus. So that when you're going through the difficulties, so that when you're going through a trial and you are exposed for people to see, what are they going to see? They're going to see Jesus. They're not going to see a lot of ugliness. They're not going to see a lot of nastiness, because your life in every aspect and every facet, your life is lived solely for Jesus. Now, when I say that, many people, they get the wrong understanding of what I'm saying. Many people would think that what I'm saying is that to live your life solely for Jesus means making everything about church. Being here when the doors are open, being at all the events of the church, doing all, and that's not at all what I'm talking about, though I think that people should do that. I do believe that is a truth, that people should be about the things of the Lord, with the people of God, in the house of the Lord, with the people of the Lord. I do believe that, but that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is not every aspect of your life having to do with church. What I'm talking about is there is no aspect of your life that is not ruled over by Jesus. That's what I'm talking about. There is no aspect of your life that is not ruled by Jesus. You could be free to be an open book. You could be free to be examined, because Jesus is your judge. Jesus has already cast judgment over every area of your life. He is already ruling over every area of your life. So you can say, I consider it fortunate to be heard by you today. I consider it fortunate for you to look into the things of my life, because when you look into the things of my life, you're going to see Jesus. You're going to see a powerful testimony to the things that Jesus has done in me. But that's the first thing that has to change. If your trial is going to become your testimony, every aspect, every area, every facet of your life has to be handed over to the lordship of Jesus. Now, continue looking here with me at verse 4 on down through 14. It says, my manner of life from my youth, spent from the beginning among my own nation in Jerusalem, Paul says, is known by all the Jews. I am an open book. They know all of my life. They know all the things that I've done. Verse 5, they have known for a long time, if they are willing to testify, that according to the strictest party of our religion, I have lived as a Pharisee. See, Paul wasn't just claiming to be a law keeper. Paul was not just claiming to be a Pharisee. Paul was saying, I lived as a Pharisee. And now I stand here on trial because of my hope in the promise made by God to our fathers, to which our 12 tribes hope to attain, as they earnestly worship day and night and day. And for this hope I am accused by the Jews, O king. Why is it thought incredible by any of you that God raises the dead? Why is it thought incredible by any of you that God raises the dead? Paul says this is insane what this trial is about. These people who are accusing me of believing the very things that they themselves should believe. I was raised as a Pharisee. I was taught as a Pharisee. I lived as a Pharisee. According to the strictest sect of our religion, I have believed the promise that God made to the 12 tribes of Israel. I have believed in the promises that God has made to our forefathers. I have believed that God raises the dead. In fact, that God has raised Jesus from the dead. O King, these are the things that these men, my accusers, should believe, and yet they would castigate me. They would accuse me and they would put me on trial for believing what they themselves should believe. Paul is saying that his belief in Jesus is not aberrant towards Judaism. It is not an offshoot of Judaism. It is not antithetical to Judaism. It is the fulfillment of Judaism. Paul is saying that he has found and understood and known to be true that Jesus Christ, raised up from the dead, is fit and called and appointed to be king over the Jews and king of the world. And he says, how can any of you think it is unreasonable that God would raise the dead? How could any of you sitting here? You notice that he was addressing Agrippa. And yet when he says, how can any of you, who mean is in the plural. That's a personal pronoun in the plural. How can any of you? He's not talking just to Agrippa anymore. This is not a direct address in the vocative to Agrippa. He's now addressing everybody here. How can any of you think it unreasonable that God raises the dead to life? Now, let me tell you, there are many things in this life that are unreasonable to believe. But God raising the dead to life is not unreasonable. God has always existed. He has made something out of nothing. He has called nothing to be something. He's hung the stars on nothing, and He's placed the universe where it is in its place, and He holds its bounds. He's called the water into existence, the earth into existence. He has formed and fashioned man out of dirt and breathed the breath of life into him. He has given every creature its amount of food on a daily basis since the time of the earth began. He has provided for, cared for, taken care of mankind all the way up to this present day. He has performed miracles. He has parted Red Seas. He has made lame to walk. He's made blind to see. He's healed many diseases. He's cast out demons. He's done everything. And in fact, He's raised the dead to life. It's not unreasonable that people would believe that God raises people from the dead. It is unreasonable that people would not believe in the God who raises the dead to life. That's what's unreasonable. And so Paul points his finger and he says, how can any of you think it unreasonable that God raises the dead? Paul says, I'm believing everything that I'm supposed to believe. I'm believing everything you should believe just as well. Paul's not just giving a defense. Paul is making an evangelistic plea. Continue looking here, verse 9. I myself was convinced that I ought to do many things in opposing the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And I did so in Jerusalem. I not only locked up many of the saints in prison after receiving authority from the chief priests, but when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. Did you find that interesting? I just find that interesting the way Paul just said that. And I did so in Jerusalem. I not only locked up many of the what? I not only locked up many of the saints. These are people Paul hated. Now he's heralding them as saints. These are people that Paul had warred against, and now he calls them brothers and sisters. Now these are people that one time he had looked at as foolish. Now he reveres them. They are the holy ones. They are the ones believing everything they should have. But when they were put to death, Paul says, I cast my vote against them. And I punished them often in all the synagogues and tried to make them blaspheme. Wasn't that a trick of the trade for the Pharisees? You remember as you read the Gospels, the Pharisees and the scribes would follow Jesus from home to home, from place to place, and they would put tests in front of him in order to trick him, in order to try to catch him in his words, so they could accuse him of blasphemy and have him put to death. But Jesus was never caught in his words. Jesus never sinned. He never slipped with his tongue whatsoever. And Paul says, I used to do this to Jesus' followers. Let me ask you this. Where do you think Paul learned that from? That's a learned ability. Where do you think Paul learned that from? I guarantee you, Paul learned it from the very men that were trying to trip up Jesus. Paul, I would even venture to say, I would go this far, that it is plausible, if not indeed likely, that the Apostle Paul, as a young boy, was following around these Pharisees that he was learning under. And he may very well have even been in some of those situations where the Jews were trying to catch Jesus in something that he said. Very plausible that Paul, as a little boy, is watching these people he looks up to, and instead of looking at Jesus, instead of these men pointing him to Jesus, they malign the Savior. Jesus says it'd be better for a millstone to be tied around the neck of a person who causes a little one to stumble, and for that person with that stone around their neck to be cast into the deepest ocean. Paul had to learn that trick of the trade from somewhere, tried to make them blaspheme, and in raging fury, verse 11, insane fury, uncontrollable, burning anger and hatred against them, I persecuted them even to foreign cities. He wasn't just happy with running them out of Jerusalem. He's not happy with running them out from town to town. Paul is not going to give up until they're in prison or they are dead. That's what Paul was after. He wasn't after just purifying a city. He's trying to cleanse the world. Look at this. Verse 12. In this connection, I journeyed to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests. Some of them may have even been there at that point. O king, at midday, O king, verse 13, I saw on the way a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, that shone around me and those who journeyed with me. That's interesting, isn't it? When did this happen? Obviously, it happened in Acts chapter 9, but what time of the day did this happen? At midday. When is the sun at its highest point, its hottest point, its brightest point in the sky? At midday. Paul says the sun is out shining bright. It's midday, but there was a light that came out that made that look like a night light compared to this. There was a light that was brighter than the sun, and it shone around me and those who journeyed with me. This was a light from heaven, not a light in the heavens. This is a light from heaven. Verse 14. And when we had fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language. This is a Jewish voice. This is a Jewish voice. And they're condemning Paul for not being Jewish. And yet it's someone speaking in the Hebrew language. This is the first time we're told this. In the Hebrew language saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. And I said, who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Never understood that in my whole life, what that meant. But if we break it down a little bit, we'll understand it a little bit better. Why do you kick against the goads? It's hard for you to kick against the goads. You know what a goad is? A goad is a stick. A goad is a stick that has been sharpened to a point on the end. See, in our days, we call them hot shots. Okay, my mother used to work at a vet clinic growing up, and I remember that I used to do this. I would be the guy on the hot shot, and we'd be getting the cattle into the pens so that the vet could either dehorn them or give them their shots or do whatever he needed to do. And so I would be on the hot shot, and the cow would not want to go where he was supposed to go. He'd be standing, he'd be refusing because he knew if I go into that chute there, something bad's going to happen here. You ever feel like that? If I go there, something bad's about to happen to me. Yeah, you know what happened though? Hit that little buzzer and put it on that cow's rear end, and he shot right there into that cage. He went right in, and bam, the door slammed on him. He's pinned right where he's supposed to be. You know, sometimes you get a stubborn one, wouldn't you? Sometimes you get a stubborn cow. You ever dealt with something stubborn? You ever dealt with an animal that's stubborn? You say, well, it's not an animal, but you dealt with somebody who's stubborn before. You know what we would do? We'd take that goad, and I'd pop that cow. Cow wouldn't move. Cow would start kicking a little bit. So I'd take that goad and I'd pop him again. Cow wouldn't move. So I just put that thing on him and I just held it down. And eventually that cow went where I wanted it to go. It's hard for you to kick against the goads. See, the way that they would do this in those ancient times, in Jesus' day, they'd have that sharp stick, and they'd walk behind that pair of oxen, and they'd take that goad, and they'd poke them in the back of the leg, poke them, and then they'd make them go. Keep walking, keep plowing, keep pulling this trailer here. And eventually, that oxen, he'd get tired of it, wouldn't want to go, wouldn't want to listen, and he'd start kicking his leg back here like that. And he'd kick that goad. Well, guess what? Every time he kicks that goad, the harder he kicks, you know what it did with it? Drove it in even deeper. And eventually, that oxen, the back of his leg was bloodied up and raw and so sensitive, the lightest touch would have made him move. The Lord says, Paul, or Saul at this point, it's a hard thing for you to kick against the goads. Paul, I've been prodding you. Paul, I've been poking you. I've been telling you where to go. I've been telling you what to do. But you fight me, and you fight me. And you know what I'm going to do? The Lord's saying with this statement, you know what I'm going to do? You're going to kick that goad so hard, I'm going to shine a light that is bright from heaven. I'm going to knock you on your back, and I'm going to blind you. You won't be able to see to hunt down my people. You will not fight me anymore. It's hard to kick against the goads. I tell you what, fighting against God is a losing battle. Fighting against God is a no-win situation. Look at what the Lord did here with Paul. It's hard for you to kick against the goads. And I said, who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise, stand upon your feet. For I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you as a servant and witness to the things in which you have seen me, and those in which I will appear to you. I love that. It's a hard thing for you to kick against the goads. So I'm going to knock you on your back. I'm going to blind you. I'll give you your sight back after you confess me as Lord. Ananias will come to you, and you'll be born again. You'll be converted, and you will be my witness. You will be the one delivering the testimony about me. I'm about to meddle here, so get ready. Your trial may become your testimony if you would just quit fighting God about it. I went there. Your trial may become your testimony if you'll just quit fighting God about it. Quit getting mad at God for the problems that you're encountering. And I'm preaching in the mirror right now. Quit getting mad at God for the problems you're encountering. You fight against the goads. You kick against the cattle prod. Your life, your trial may very well end up being the testimony to Jesus if you just quit fighting Him on it. Is He not the one who has permitted it to be so? Yes, He has. When we fight against Him and say, why, Lord? It's not fair. It's not right. Are we yielding to the Lord, or are we kicking against the goads? We're kicking. Your trial may become your testimony if you just quit fighting God about it. If you start looking to see, okay, Lord, I'm done fighting. I'm on my back. I'm blinded. I'm tapping out. Lord, now that I've given up, you show me, please. Show me what you are trying to accomplish through me, through this trial. Okay, Paul, I've got you going to Damascus. You're going to meet a man there by the name of Ananias. He's going to tell you more about me. You're going to believe, you're going to be baptized, and you will be my witness. Now, Paul's not fighting against the Lord anymore. You know what this tells me? This tells me that for some time, the Lord had been prodding Paul. Maybe that's the reason he was in a raging fury against the Christians, because he was convicted. You ever met somebody like that? They're convicted about their sin and they're mad at everybody else for it. Maybe that's where Paul was. I don't know. Your trial may become your testimony if you'll quit fighting God about it. Now look at this. He says, but rise and stand upon your feet, verse 16, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you as a servant and witness to the things in which you have seen me and those in which I will appear to you, delivering you from your people. Underline that, put that in your memory. We're going to come back to that here in a little bit. Delivering you from your people and from the Gentiles. We're going to come back to that too. To whom I am sending you. He's delivering Paul from people that he is going to send him to. To open their eyes, not to kill them. I'm delivering you from them not to kill them. I'm delivering you from them to open their eyes, so that they may turn from darkness to light, from the power of Satan. They're not your enemies. They are in the power of Satan. They are controlled by him. I'm sending you to them. From the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. Therefore, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient, verse 19, to the heavenly vision, but declared first to those in Damascus, then in Jerusalem, and throughout all the region of Judea, and also to the Gentiles, that they should repent and turn to God, performing deeds in keeping with their repentance. For this reason, the Jews seized me in the temple and tried to kill me. We think, oh Lord, why won't you rise up and kill Paul's enemies? Remember that. That's a point here we'll get to. To this day, rather, I have had the help that comes from God, and so I stand here testifying to both small and great. I stand here testifying. He is the help that only comes from God. I stand here testifying. He's not standing there on a field of the bodies of his enemies. He's standing there testifying to the ones who would call themselves his enemy. So I stand here testifying both to small and great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass, that the Christ must suffer, and that by being the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light both to our people and to the Gentiles. Say, Paul, you're the one being accused. But Paul, you can't quit talking about Jesus, about his resurrection, about deliverance from trouble, about preaching the gospel to Jews, preaching the good news to the Gentiles, salvation, forgiveness of sins, everlasting life. Paul, you're on trial here as Paul. And Paul's supposed to be defending Paul. But Paul's not saying much about Paul, is he? You see that? Paul is supposed to be defending Paul, but he's not saying much about Paul. Who is he talking about? He's talking about Jesus. I'm about to dig in and meddle here again. Your trial will become a testimony when you quit talking so much about yourself and start talking about Jesus. Your trial will become a testimony if you will quit talking so much about yourself and start talking about Jesus. Some people can't talk about the sufficiency of Christ in their problems because they can't quit talking about their problems. Some people can't talk about the goodness of God to them because they can't quit looking at the badness of their situation. Some people can't see the help that God has given them, the life that He has put in their lungs and in their heart. Some people can't see the help that God has given them because they can't quit complaining about their difficult circumstances. Friend, whatever trial you're going through, it can become a testimony if you'll quit talking so much about yourself. Start telling people how Jesus is working in that trial. Start making the trial about who it's supposed to be about. It's about Jesus. It's about His grace. It's about His goodness. That frees you from having to win. Because winning for you becomes about talking about Jesus. Winning doesn't come for you based on the verdict of the trial. It comes in how you handle the trial. Y'all tracking with me? Your trial can become a testimony if you quit talking so much about yourself and talk more about Jesus. Look at verse 24 through 32. The verdict of the hearing. Now, it's a verdict in two ways. Just like the trial testimony was a testimony in two ways. A verdict in two ways. This is the verdict of the hearing. In one way, you'll get the judge's ruling. You'll get King Herod Agrippa's ruling here on Paul. But you'll also get Festus and Agrippa's ruling on the gospel. You'll get a verdict two ways here. Look at this. Therefore, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient. Drop down to verse 24. And he was saying these things in his defense. Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, you are out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind. Isn't that interesting? In verse 11, Paul said he was insane with rage when he was hunting down Christians. He's repented of that because God's changed his life. And now that he's telling people the good news about the resurrection of the dead, now Festus says, oh my gosh, Paul, you're insane. You're out of your mind. Paul's going to say, I'm in my right mind here. This is me sane. You ever felt like you had to say that to people? Because they're confused. Are you sane? Are you insane? Paul says, I'm in my right mind here. Festus, he can't wrap his mind around the fact that God would raise the dead to life, or that God would use His Christ, His anointed one, to die on a cross and to be raised up from the dead. That is foolishness, that God would send His only Son to die for the sins of human beings. That is foolishness to a Greek mind like Festus. So he says, you are out of your mind. Does this say in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, for the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. The word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing. People who are dying and on their way to hell and mad at God and angry, and they kick against the goad all the time. They can't wrap their mind around the fact that God has been prodding and calling them to follow Him. They can't wrap their mind around the fact that they need to be forgiven of their sins. They can't yield to the fact that they are going to be accountable to God when they die. So they say, Paul, you're out of your mind. This is foolishness, that God would send His only begotten Son to die on the cross for the sins of the world, and that anybody who believes would have eternal life. He says that's foolishness. Look at what Paul says. He says, but Paul said, I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I am speaking true and rational words. For the king knows about these things, for to him I speak boldly. For I am persuaded that none of these things has escaped his notice. For this has not been done in a corner. It says everybody knows Jesus was raised from the dead. This didn't happen in some corner of history. This happened in plain sight. Everybody in Jerusalem knows Jesus was raised up. And King Agrippa, verse 27, do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe. Do you believe the prophets? Here's Paul going back to his time when he used to try to make the Christians to blaspheme. And now here's Paul with his genius mind. And he turns to Agrippa, who is the king of the Jews. And he turns to Agrippa and says, now I've proven that God has promised to raise the dead to life. Now Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? Now if Agrippa says, well, no, well, guess what happens to Agrippa? He gone. But Agrippa can't say no. Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? He knows that Agrippa has to believe, or at least he has to give lip service to it. So he says, I know you believe. And if you believe the prophets, you have to believe in Jesus. Look at what Agrippa says. Verse 32, and Agrippa said, let me find my spot here. And Agrippa said to Paul, in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? And Paul said, whether short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might be such as I am, except for these chains. Then the king rose, and the governor and Bernice and those who were sitting with them. And when they had withdrawn, they said to one another, this man is doing nothing deserving death or imprisonment. Paul is vindicated once more, just as he was in chapter 23, just as he was in chapter 25. Luke is careful to point that out, that everybody said Paul was innocent. And Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. And to Caesar he will go in chapter 27. Now, this is what I find very, very interesting. And this is the last point here. The last thing that has to change if your trial is going to become a testimony. You notice how Paul is on trial here before Herod Agrippa. He's on trial here before Festus, before a Roman tribunal with his accusers calling out names and accusations against him. Yet what does Paul do? Paul gives one of the most winsome speeches ever given. Paul is not seeking to defend himself so much as he is seeking to be winsome for the sake of Christ. Paul is not trying to win the trial. He's trying to win their hearts to Jesus. So Agrippa says, would you persuade me so quickly to become a Christian? Paul says, I wish I could. Whether it takes me a short time or a long time, I want you, everybody out here, to be such as I am, except for these chains. You know what? Paul would have never gotten there if he had seen Agrippa as his enemy. Paul would have never gotten there if he had seen Porcius Festus as his enemy. Paul would have never gotten there if he'd have seen the Jews as his enemy. Look at this. Very quickly here. When Jesus appears to Paul on Damascus Road here, verse 17 of the same chapter, he says that I will deliver you from your people and from the Gentiles, to whom I am sending you to open their eyes. He said, Paul, these people are not your enemies. I'm delivering you from them, not so you can kill them, not so I can kill them. I'm delivering you from them so that you can open their eyes, so that they receive eternal life. Look at what he says here in verse 21. For this reason the Jews seized me in the temple and tried to kill me. To this day I have had the help that comes from God, and so I stand here testifying both to small and great. God has delivered him from people who would seek to kill him time and again. Why has he delivered him from them? Not so that he could kill them. He delivered him so that he could testify to them. So that he could stand before Agrippa, not as Agrippa's enemy. He didn't see Agrippa as an enemy. He saw Agrippa as the mission. Your trial will become a testimony when you quit seeing people apart from Christ as your enemy and start seeing them as God's mission. Your trial will become a testimony when you quit seeing people apart from Christ as your enemy and start seeing them as God's mission. But we like enemies, don't we? We like to look across the political aisle and call people our enemies. I don't care about politics. Politics is stupid. Politics is going to be over when Jesus comes back. It's dumb. There are core principles we got to believe. But when people don't believe those principles, it doesn't mean they're our enemy. People who are apart from Christ need Christ. They don't need their political party changed. That's not the battle. It's not the battle. That's not the fight for us. The fight for us is for the souls of people. Here's Paul standing on trial for things he has not done, and he can't help but try to win people to Jesus. Everybody is across the aisle from him. Everybody and their mother. He can't help but try to win them to Jesus. Your trial will become a testimony when you quit seeing people apart from Christ as an enemy and start seeing them as a mission of God. Oh, thanks be to God, he didn't look at me as an enemy. What did God say to Paul on the road to Damascus? He says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? You're warring against Christians, but you're not their enemy. You're mine. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Says the Lord Jesus. Does Jesus snuff him out in a moment? Seems like God had a mission. Seems like rather than God making his enemies into the dirt from which they came, he actually turns them into his friends. God wasn't interested in killing Paul. God was interested in saving Paul. God always defends his people. He will right every wrong. God may not put the enemies of Christ to death here on earth at this point because he may be saving them for grace. Your trial can become a testimony when you quit seeing people apart from Christ as enemies and start seeing them as a mission of God. Friends, when you live for God's glory and make his mission your passion, your trial can become a testimony. Now, believer, that's for you. Person who hasn't been walking with Jesus, you've been going through some things, you've been fighting against God, and you've been kicking against the goads. How long? How long? God steers you to this point. He brings you here this morning. You hear this message. God calls you to believe in him. And I would invite you today to no longer fight against the Lord. Let those trials that have brought you here be what brings you to Jesus. No longer fighting against him. Would you pray with me?